Hello, I'm Paul with the Garland County Library, and we are live with Marsalis Weatherspoon, and we're on episode 8 of Perceptions of Color. Can you believe we've made it to episode 8 already?
Not at all. It's a whirlwind, but here we are.
It is Mr. Weatherspoon. If you don't know, or this is your first time joining in, he wears many hats. He's a musician, a speaker, a public servant, and currently serves as the president of the local NAACP branch, Hot Springs branch number 6013. And today's topic is Deseg Revisited, and has a very special guest who I'll let Marsalis introduce here momentarily. But as always, if you have any questions or comments or suggestions for future episodes of the series and you're watching live, please don't hesitate to share those. And when you're done with this video, go back and tune into the previous episodes if you haven't seen them already. All right, Marsalis, it's all you.
Thank you again, Mr. Paul. And again, welcome to the Perceptions of Color, an exploration to all facets of the African American experience. And this is episode 8. And today we have a very interesting, very rich, deep topic, and that is Deseg or desegregation, particularly in the county of Garland County, Arkansas. And as you will find out, it's quite interesting how we plug into the larger tapestry of the desegregation movement here in America. My guest today is Miss Jeri Maghoney, born and raised in San Joaquin, Delta Valley of Northern California. She has been a resident of Hot Springs for the last 16 years. She's a graduate of UALR with a BA in history and a double minor in social studies and secondary education. She is currently in her 5th year as social studies educator at Hot Springs World Class High School. She teaches economics, personal finance, and the history of the Americas. She's a dedicated educator, and she was selected as Teacher of the Year for the 2020-21 school year. She was also the recipient of the Hanamaki Sister City Exchange Program Scholarship and part of a delegation of teachers that visited Hanamaki, Japan. In 2017, her research paper on the desegregation of Hot Springs School District was featured in a 4-part installation in the Sentinel Record. So ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Ms. Jeri Maghoney.
Hello, it's very good to be here with you all today.
Yes, and if you don't mind me saying, Miss Jeri is a friend and a colleague. We work together in the Hot Springs School District. So thank you for joining us today, and thank you for just being everything you are to our students in this community.
Well, I thank you very much for harking me back to this research paper I wrote quite some years ago.
Right, exactly. So yeah, let's start there. Like, what got you interested in the subject of desegregation?
I grew up, like I said, I grew up in California, very multicultural part of California. I graduated from a town in Northern California called Stockton, and it had one of the largest Filipino populations. I'm Mexican and Filipino myself, and everywhere I went around that Delta there's so much history and cultural history of the various minority groups that have come through that area, with the Chinese and the Japanese and the Filipinos and then the Mexicans all coming in. And so I've loved history, and there's just so much of it around me. When I moved to Hot Springs and moved to the South, it's different. It's very different here. And just that kind of like, how do we have these things around us? Like, how do we have this type of building, and when did it get here, and why is this statue here? And so I've always been intrigued by those kinds of things. And when I was in college, I took a class from the famed Dr. Kirk on civil rights, the classic civil rights era. And I had to write a research paper. And so my children go to Hot Springs School District, and I know that there was 2 schools, and one for the Black population and one for the white population. And I just wanted to know how there became, like, just how that process went. So I just came to the school itself and started to literally look in the very large, dusty books of the minutes from the 1950s, like just hand flipping through all of these binders, and just put in the time to look for it. And I just really wanted to know, like, how this place that informs culture and identity within my own children, how has that impacted their community and their friends and everybody that they know. And I just really wanted to know.
Wow. You touched on something that kind of came up last month with my guest at that time, Janice Kearney. And you spoke on how you have children in the district and how they're impacted by this discussion. And so as researchers, as journalists, sometimes we have that thought where we have to be objective and just kind of look at things. But it sounds like you had kind of a vested interest in talking about culture, talking about race, giving your background and giving your, like you said, this stark transition to this new cultural landscape in Arkansas.
Yes, very much so. I wanted to know. I wanted to know why the city was like it, how it became to be. You know, the city has, you know, it's not like, you know, there's the railroad tracks and there's one side and there's the other. And I think that's because of time. But I think if maybe I were here in the 70s, then I would still be able to see that. If I were here in the 60s, I would see that. If I were here in the 50s, it would be immensely in my face. So because of the interest I have in society and culture, I see those things. And so I love history, and I wanted to trace it back and to say, like, how did we get here? And why is my district that I put my children in the most diverse in this county, where there are 6 districts and they are vastly nowhere near the numbers of diversity. And I just thought that was like very, very different, because even in where I grew up, most of the schools were culturally, their cultural makeup is very similar, and way more. There's just so many more cultures of people out there, but as close as the schools were in the town, their cultural makeup was very similar. And now here it's very different. And so I just was like, wow, there's this tiny little town with completely different impacts on the students that come through there. And I chose to put my kids in Hot Springs School District. When I moved to Hot Springs, the realtor told us the best district to live in is Lake Hamilton School District. You don't want to be in Hot Springs School District. So we moved to Lake Hamilton School District. And then when my children got to school age, I had a couple neighbors in the neighborhood who were sending their kids to park, and they told me about the IB program, and they told me about the school. So I went and toured that school and loved it. And I didn't tour Lake Hamilton, but I did drive around it. And I don't know, I just thought we don't have super camp. I didn't grow up in a super campus like that. And when I researched the schools online, I was like, I'm going to put him in this IB school because I like the theology of IB education. And I like that the school is more diverse, because I grew up in an immensely diverse place. And I wanted to give that to my kids. And I believe that, you know, above all else, they're going to be humans in the world. And I want them to be able to feel comfortable and just be comfortable with diversity, I guess. Like I didn't want it to be like a passing thing. I want it to just be a part of their lives. And I don't know how to do that, but by exposure.
Right. Yeah. Diversity kind of fundamental, not just kind of just on a surface level, for sure. And of course, you know, we are both employees of Hot Springs, as has been stated, but no partiality whatsoever, right? We're just talking about our experiences as human beings. And I am a product of the Hot Springs School District. I'm a product of the IB program. I went to Park Elementary School, so I can attest to everything you just said. The experience, the diversity, just the immersion, and just everything that has got me to where I am. So shout out. Anyway, so you kind of glossed over John Kirk. You just mentioned his name, but not everybody knows like how awesome he is. Like every week I listen to him on KUAR, and he's the Donaghy Distinguished Professor of History, and he's just awesome. So who's John Kirk, for those who may not know?
Well, he is, like you said, the professor of the Donaghy Scholars at the University of Little Rock, or University of Arkansas at Little Rock, rebranding. And he also is over the, he teaches the classes. He's a professor of like civil rights, the classical civil rights era, and he's over that, like the minor you can get in that study. And so I took his class on the classic era of civil rights, and he, I mean, just knows it all and is very active and willing to participate in communities discussions and research and things like that. And I think he's immensely supportive, and so I felt very empowered to write a research paper as an undergrad this large, which, you know, writing this paper, I probably could have saved it for a master's, but I didn't, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to do it. And he, I mean, I used some of his books in my research. Like he's that, you know, he's that prolific in the topic and of the Little Rock crisis and surrounding areas. And so it was very, I felt very fortunate to work with him or to have his guidance in writing a paper like this as an undergrad.
That is awesome. And like, what an awesome opportunity to sit under his tutelage like that. And like you said, he's just a nice guy. He and I emailed back and forth, and he'll be joining us hopefully in the near future. But getting back to your topic. So in the course of your research, kind of what was the takeaway? What did you uncover when you started digging into this topic?
So the first thing that I discovered is, you know, first and foremost, I was a parent before I was an employee of the school district. So I didn't really, and before I was a history teacher, just reflecting on my own education in desegregation, you know, you have the high points of Little Rock 9, Dr. King, you know, just your basic high points, like that's really it, right? But you don't really hear about like the other side. Like it's taught in a very honorific hero perspective. So you don't really hear the other side, like, well, who were they fighting against? Who were those people? And so that was what you know, I learned first, you know, by taking advanced classes. But what I discovered was, you know, people have thought about this for very long and studied it for a very long time. And there's an author, Arthur J. Harvey Wilkinson, and he wrote a book called The Supreme Court from the Brown to Bakke, which is actually a pretty old book. And he talked about the phases of desegregation and how they had phases of absolute defiance, which is evident in what the Little Rock 9 had. And that's kind of what we think of when we think of desegregation, that it was like this huge fight. But in the same token that, you know, Dr. King would say that it's not just these loud vocal opponents of desegregation, it's really in the passiveness of those others. The token compliance and the lighter shades of defiance by school districts is what was broadly experienced across the nation, and that's what Hot Springs actually experienced. And so a lot of different things brought that more token compliance, that more subdued defiance to desegregation. They literally just found enough to qualify as desegregation because there was no outline or stipulation established by the Supreme Court. So what did desegregation look like? And of course, desegregation looked like Black children going into white schools instead of white children going into Black schools. And was it one child? Was it 5? Was it 20? And so a lot of schools were like 1 counts. And that is pretty much what Hot Springs School District did. They started with a very small group of boys working at the gorge, fixing buses. So they didn't actually integrate in the actual education of children in classrooms. They took boys from Langston, picked them up, took boys from the high school, picked them up, drove them out to the gorge, and they worked on the buses. And that was the extent of the desegregation in Hot Springs School District for for a pretty long time. What I also found before that was there was a very strong, vibrant community in Hot Springs that was very interested in desegregating the schools very early on. So some early fighters that Hot Springs had their support of was, of course, Ms. Daisy Bates and Mr. Flowers, a lawyer. They were here talking with Iman Bruce, who was the superintendent at the time, and literally outlining the deficits between the separate and equal and the school buildings, facilities, books, and just really trying to outline what was not equal. And the superintendent's comment back was like, well, we had a meeting that you guys could have come to, and your representative from your race did not come. So we could have, fixed the hole in the wall or patched the, the floor here or whatever. And you guys didn't bring that to the front. So everything was put down, but the superintendent at that time was not interested in integrating the school. And he wanted to improve the facilities of the Black schools in Hot Springs School District to entice the Black population to keep their kids there and feel like there's no need to integrate because our facilities are equal now. And so that's like another way of subverting integration by enticing everybody to stay where they're at.
Wow. So just the bare minimum, basically, just to get by and just, comply just a little bit. Wow. And you gave several examples of, of that in the course of, what you just said. So thank you for shedding light on that. I wasn't even aware of a few of those things. So was Hot Springs kind of an outlier, or was this kind of going on across the country? Like, where did we stand, across the country in terms of desegregation?
I think we fell in the more broader used way. States like Virginia and Mississippi and locations like Little Rock experienced that very high grade of absolute defiance where, we're shutting down the schools and nobody's getting in. Like that's almost like an extreme. We were much more with everybody else because of the publicity, with the invention of television and being able to carry a camera to the location and having that broadcasted into homes. That's like something my dad remembers watching on TV. Cities around the country were like, okay, we don't want to be Virginia. We don't want to be Little Rock. How can we still achieve our end, but in a way that doesn't look as ugly? And the way to do that was to, like I said, start off with small groups, like off campus somewhere, like a location that didn't say this was the Black school or this was the white school, a location that was neutral or with a small set of students. And in Hot Springs School District, after the complaints, several complaints from the African American leaders in town complaining about these members at the Gorge or these students at the Gorge being the only students integrating, then they, were insisting on actually integrating the students themselves. And that did not happen until we had a new member move into Hot Springs from Kansas City or not Kansas City. I have to look at my notes. But he moved to Hot Springs and became a part of the NAACP, and he was a pastor at the Roanoke Church. And that's when things changed. And I'm sure you probably know.
You have to be talking about Donald Rice.
Yes, absolutely. And he's really what was the catalyst for the real integration in Hot Springs. But for the longest time, all Hot Springs had was that integrated shop. And when Dr. Rice came to town and he wanted, I'm so grateful that our district is a different place now. But when I really think about like how kids could live around the corner from Jones School, but have to walk from, if you know our town, having to walk from Jones School all the way across town, cross Central, cross Malvern, to go to schools like Goldstein, you know, like that's so far to make children walk. Like, and I don't know if we don't have sidewalks in town like we should today. So I can't imagine sending my 6-year-old with hopefully an older sibling or cousin to walk so far to school. And so, I mean, that was just kind of like a common sense complaint that he had. Like, why should we have to send our children to walk so far across all of these busy streets when literally we live right around the corner from this school? And it is well past the passing of Brown versus the Board of Education. And we are in the 60s, 1963, and we deserve more. And so he insisted on creating change within the school district. And by that time, more schools were coming around to changing, and so were some pushes from above, from government institutions. And then, you know, there is the whole idea of attaching money to schools with integration and things like that, like federal money getting involved. And then that changed the game later. But the real change with integrating our schools came with Dr. Rice and his commitment to the NAACP in town and bringing that about.
Absolutely. You're saying all the right things. Well, when I say, you know, where do we stand? Are we an outlier? Is it weird? Because I just, knowing that there are 7 school districts in this small county has always struck me as, you know, is that common? Because, you know, I don't know of any other county like that, you know, in Arkansas, let alone anywhere else, like, you know, having these 7 school districts. And how was that precipitated? No, those are the kind of questions I ask, and I wasn't back there when all that was going on. But I just find it very interesting how we got, like you said, how did we get where we are? Yeah.
Well, I definitely feel like the Hot Springs was a different place back then. The Hot Springs School District the population was much bigger than it is today. Like we don't have the pictures hanging in the hallways anymore, but if you could even look at the numbers of students from the 60s as compared to the 80s, for example, and they're much smaller, and even today. So I think the city itself was different. You know, gambling was still around, tourism was really at its peak. So the city was a completely different place. And I think in more rural places, I mean, I know for a fact, so rural schools surrounding Hot Springs would send their children to Langston School District. So when you lived in a smaller school district, like, for example, Fort Smith, they didn't have as large of a Black population. So it was actually kind of expensive to bus their students away from their one white rural school to Langston, because you had to pay for that, you know, and it was actually easier to just say, look, guys, we've got 3 families, or however many, you know, they're very small, the number of Black students that they had, like in Fort Smith. So they just were like, we're all just going to come to school. That was just easier, cheaper, faster. So rural places, that might have been easier to do. And when, you know, we're just talking like about the 60s, we're not even getting into like what happens in the 80s with people building more schools and changing and things like that. But our school district had money to build new schools to, again, support the de facto segregation without having to really be ugly about it. And with Hot Springs being a tourist town then, practically for millennia, and now nobody wanted to have the struggles that were experienced by Little Rock. And that's on both sides, because Hot Springs attracted a huge amount of Black patrons to all of the wonderful event venues, and just the great time you could have on, you know, Black Wall Street, which was Malvern Avenue, just like the white community would come to Central Avenue and all of the amazing things that they had over there. And nobody wanted that. So people wanted change, but people were also constantly cautious, or conscious thank you, of the fact that it could ruin the livelihood of everybody in a lot of ways. And I think that that's something that is always at the top of our city leaders, is that we are a tourist town and nobody wants to talk about crime or publicize that kind of stuff. So it's always at the forefront. It's a guiding practice, I think, even to this day.
Right. That makes so much sense. Our demographic and our clientele that we serve in the city is different from these other towns in Arkansas. We're a national park. We're America's first resort.
Mm-hmm.
Everything that you're saying bears that out. Let's just hit a few highlights on this timeline. Let's start 1954 with Brown v. Board and that landmark decision and the implication. And I'm not sure if you know the Hot Springs connection to that with Dr. Phipps.
Yes, absolutely.
So, want to go ahead, or anybody that matter?
Your turn.
Okay, yeah. Well, so Dr. Phipps, Hot Springs resident, she had what was called the doll test. And what the doll test said was that Blacks saw themselves as inferior to whites because they didn't have that type of representation. So it was important for Blacks children to see themselves and people that look like them as role models, so they could have that sense of pride and that sense of self-worth. And her contribution was included in that landmark Brown v. Board decision. So just the Hot Springs connection is just awesome. So going from Brown v. Board into the 60s. Well, let's rewind to 57 with the Little Rock Nine. So what happened with Little Rock Nine?
So much. I'm going to take it back just a little bit before that. I'll take it back to 1954. So after 1954, even here in Hot Springs, so in the fall of 1954, we had our NAACP in Hot Springs actually petitioned the school board that was led at the time at Dr. Bruce, Bruce, and it was filed by, and you might know these families of these people. There was Joseph Glynn, Chester Briggs, Era Rigmaiden, and Genevieve Anderson, and they were backed by Arkansas famous lawyers, Wiley Branton and Christopher Mercer and Daisy Bates, to tell our school board, let's integrate. So our district had been fighting immediately just to try and get that done and to push as much as possible. And the northern southern states were believed to be places that were straddling the line of deep South and just complete northern integration. And if maybe these northern cities could integrate, then these northern southern states could integrate, then it could, be modeled by deeper South cities and districts and things like that. So we were already, the city itself was already kind of trying to go that way. And I do believe that the NAACP of Arkansas was looking for the right place to be the model of integration. And I think because Hot Springs was a different place at that time, it was just Little Rock and Hot Springs at that time, that I think it could have been us. You know what I'm saying? I think it could have gone either way. But with the Little Rock Nine, there is a delegation of students that were carefully selected by the NAACP of Little Rock, led by Daisy Bates, to integrate the Little Rock Central High School. And after several meetings and discussions of how it was going to go, of course, in a time of home phones and not easy connections, communications get lost. They decide on the day they're going to go, and that everybody is enraged. And I won't go too deep into it because we all have seen it's probably the one and only thing that 95% of Americans have actually learned about desegregation. And it didn't go the way everybody wanted it to go. The governor decides that he is going to support a absolute defiance of integration. The students, have an encounter with white patrons and students and families, and it is heartbreaking to watch and see, a man get his head bashed in and have a young girl screamed at in her face as she is just trying to walk to school, who came to our district just last week the other weekend to speak. And the governor basically shut down school. To stop that, he shut down school for an entire year for everybody. And so that also created a influx into private schools, and that basically outpriced, poor and minority citizens of the city, where they couldn't afford that luxury. And that was a better price to pay than to look at everybody equally.
Right. So we moved from de jure segregation being the law to de facto, where there's this white flight to, like you said, these private or more expensive institutions that we're priced out of, definitely. So yes, Miss Elizabeth Eckford was just with us last week, and she was just phenomenal. I was not able to be here, but by all accounts, she did a phenomenal job just recounting what she endured as a member of the Little Rock Nine. So very much with us today, and she released a book. So Little Rock Nine and 57 gets national attention, and then we fast forward to, like you said, 63, and then we have the 65 integration of Hot Springs High and the closing of Langston High School. And we just found out about that a couple of months ago during our Black History celebration. Cheryl Batts, of course, and the VCK, Democratic Women's Club, they did a viewing of the Langston documentary, and Miss Minnie Lennox and Thomas Anderson were part of their first integrated class. And they talked about the ups and the downs of that experience of, coming to a very welcoming family kind of feel at Langston, whereas they're geographically in a new territory, and, the new high school, and the culture shock of being going from all Black staff to all white staff, all white classes and things of that nature. And so that was a very, if you haven't seen that documentary, definitely check it out. So that is 60, I want to say 66 was the first graduating class, first integrated graduating class. Did you find anything in the course of research around that time in the mid 60s to early 70s?
Yeah, so the integrated group that attended the automotive class, that began in 1956 to 1957, and that took a year of negotiation back and forth to get that to pass. I spoke to several members of the community on both sides of the color line. I tried to reach out to as many people that were alive at that time as adults, to just kind of understand what it felt like what was the tension like, were people like, we don't even care, it's just the people at top that are worried about this. I didn't really know. I was trying to understand what was the average person really feeling about the status of integration at that time. And one of the things that I wondered was, why didn't they just put the kids in the high school that already was here? So they had to build a new high school anyway, because that building was old and they needed to build a new one. And Hot Springs was spreading west at that time. And that's how we get the junior high. And that was built with the assumption that perhaps there might be integration coming soon. So let's build this junior high out west, again, another facility to kind of keep the white kids in this area over here, and we can keep Langston populated with its community over there. And when the district decided to build the new high school, something that was told to me, and I haven't found it in actual records or anything, but one of the things that I heard was that they were told that they were going to add the lions, or they were going to come up with a new colors, like a new mascot, something like that. And they didn't. And they kept the Trojans, and Langston lost all its identity, all its colors, everything that or they're the Bulldogs, right? Yes. They lost it all. And that was like heartbreaking. And I had asked the wife of a former board member at that time why they chose that. Like, why did it become still Hot Springs High and not, like, I don't know, a different, like, Washita Mountain High or something? Like, why was it not something different? And she just simply said to me, like, why would we ever do that? Like, it didn't even cross their mind, like the value of maintaining that identity or coming up with a new one where everybody could just be new together. It like didn't even make sense. And so I kind of took that to be that the city was like a lot of places, that it's not the dominant culture that needs to do the assimilation and the integration, but the other. And it was on the other to do the integration, to do the changes, to do the assimilation, because that is just the status quo. And so that's the bar, and everybody has to fold into that. When I actually did reach out, and I spoke with the superintendent at the time that the school was built. He was still alive. He had moved and to work at Fayetteville, Dr. Hughes Mills, who became the superintendent after Iman Bruce. And they were very concerned about what would happen when we mixed the kids together. They were very concerned about how that would go. And he was very old at the time, and I asked him, like, why didn't you bring any of the teachers over? Like, why wouldn't you bring more than 2 teachers? And again, he didn't really have an answer. Like, it's just we're working with people's social developments, and if that's their consciousness at that time, like, there's not really a good answer that you could give, I think, to somebody researching, like, basically, why did you make this kind of racist decision? Do you know what I'm saying? And yeah. Not to say that that's what that man is, but that's what that effectively was. Like, why would we bring any of those teachers? What for? We have a whole building full of teachers, and so, and speaking to Black teachers who experienced coworkers that had lost their job, like, as a teacher myself, just thinking about it, like, that's it. Like, there's not even an interview process to be like, is this teacher better than this teacher? There's nothing of that. It was just clearly like, we're building a new school. These ones will come over, and thank you for your service. See you later. And I just, like, how could that be? So, yeah, the building of the school was a mark of pride for the district, doing something modern. They thought, they went and looked at malls. Malls were like a really cool thing. And if you look at the building, and you notice that we have, like, display cases and, like, a central eating area, this kind of, like, hallways of classrooms. That was because malls were cool at the time. And so they're very proud of that. And it's different to me to hear people talk about what an advancement that was, and how, like, just building that school is, I think building a school must be a very exciting prospect for superintendents. And so you get that kind of feedback when you ask about it, not so much about, like, well, what was it like inside?
Right. So yeah, like they say in the Bible, out of the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, let every word be established. So everything that you said was corroborated. Like I said, when we had that Langston discussion, they talked about how they were the Bulldogs, and they had such a sense of pride with that mascot and the colors of blue and gold, and how that was just erased and without an apology, and the overtures that were made and the promises that weren't kept, and the heartbreak that brought to those students, especially when you have a sense of community that kind of was around the orbit of that school. You knew your teachers, you probably went to church with them, you probably were neighbors in the same area geographically, and so to have all of that upended and then not have those promises kept. So again, like we say in the church, you're walking heavy, you're in the house. So fast forwarding, some time passes, and we get into the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. What did you find there, or was that in the scope of your research?
Not to this paper, and not in this paper. I stopped at this paper primarily just trying to look at the desegregation. Like, we got to desegregation like at the by the end of the 1970s. Desegregation in the district itself started with elementary school children. Very few of them, I'm going to count them here. I think there's maybe 7 of them integrated in like the first and second grades of school after, of course, careful selection. And I'm going to quote one of the women that I spoke to. So the first students were Nina Felice Atkins, Frederick Anthony, Earl Lee Briggs, Fred Gwynn, Robert Lee Hill, Gwendolyn Kristen Nolan, Danelda Rice, and Daryl Dean Smith. So they attended first and second grade. And when I spoke with Nina, she literally said, I didn't know that I was Black until I went to school. Like, that idea of what that meant, she didn't know it meant different. She just knew that people were darker, people were lighter, and that it was what it was. But she didn't know it till she went somewhere only. And she just has accounts of like, when she sweat a student, they're in first grade. They said, they're like, is it like chocolate milk? Like, they had no understanding of like anything about each other. She literally says, I'm going to tell you the truth. I didn't know I was Black until I was in the second grade. Like, she just didn't have that at all. And she had an account where she was, they sat her down and they told her with great gravity and sincerity, they said, you are a Black child. You are no better. You are no different. But by race, you are a Black child. So when I think about that, like how you carry that as a 6-year-old and like, what does that even mean to you? It's like, it kind of makes my heart hurt, as a mother, as a teacher, like just trying to be like, wow, like you have to carry that as a tiny baby. So that's what our district did to those children of Hot Springs. And that was the brand of desegregation at that time. And not everybody was very happy with that. So they did this gradual school kind of integration. I have not traced, and I don't have the actual documents to back it up right now, but you can tell within the city and with the current population of school districts that there had to be a white flight redlining that had happened. And just with anecdotal information from people whose parents were longtime realtors in town, just the fast leaving of the downtown areas and uptown and things like that, and people going into different parts of town that were not quite as developed, happens pretty quickly. And then the federal government starts to kind of put the squeeze on districts to force them to actually begin to integrate, because they are going to give them some federal money. And if you're going to have this federal money, you have to adhere to these new civil rights laws that were established by newly designed departments within the government. The HEW had new guidelines that were being imposed on school districts. So districts were like, okay, there is no more token integration. Token integration is literally just as bad as absolute desegregation, because it lasted longer. Like, yes, the Little Rock crisis happened for a year, but we're looking at like 14 years in Hot Springs School District. You know what I'm saying? So like the slow, they were definitely just trying to not cause any attention, not bring too much attention to the district, not disrupt anybody's homeostasis on, their neighborhoods and all of that. So that kind of was a more pervasive, that's like a weed slowly choking out something. So by allowing this token integration, you allowed people to have more years of embedded mentalities about the value of desegregation to your community and the impact of it on your children. And I think that then created in the 80s, when I just began to preview that definitely there begins to have some rumblings of busing, like in Boston, for example. Like, is that going to happen in Hot Springs? I don't want that to happen here. And what an inconvenience. But what does that mean, inconvenience? If you're going to be bused in a town that's, I don't know, 6 square miles. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not that far.
Right.
And yes, in other parts of the country, children were bused, 30, 40 minutes each way, and it was very uncomfortable, and I get that. But, sometimes things, I don't know, people aren't always willing to do it on their own. So there has to be some sort of catalyst. And I never had experience busing. Like I said, my area was just completely diverse as it was. But, here you could see that still so close. I have friends that are my age. I'm 43, and they remember living closer to one school in Hot Springs, but needing to be bused to another one to like keep the ratio of diversity at a more proportionate level.
Right. So again, you're saying all the right things, because Nina Webb, she spoke to our branch last year about her experiences integrating the school. And then we had her daughter, Cecily Hicks, back in December, and she talked about her family celebrating Kwanzaa. So we're going to have both of those people back on, and we're definitely going to have Miss Nina Webb come back and share her experience, because I knew all those names and all those families that you talked about. So this is just awesome. So we're going to throw out to Paul, because we could just keep going. But let's see was there any questions or comments that came out tonight?
Well, that was very enlightening, and I also went to Hot Springs School District, so we're in good company here.
Awesome.
Once a Trojan, always a Trojan,
That's right. And just want to reflect on the Elizabeth Eckford event that happened earlier this month, or last Saturday. It was amazing. I got to deliver Miss Eckford to the event, and then I picked her up from her house in Little Rock, and it was just a wonderful experience. And she was a great woman, and she's 80 years old, but her talk went on for an hour and a half, and she had so much energy, and it was very passionate, and it was so good. But
living history.
Yeah, absolutely. But there was a question that was asked to Miss Eckford at that event, and I thought she gave a great answer, but I'd like to hear for you to answer this. Someone asked, can you define, for someone who might not know, the differences between desegregation and integration?
Go ahead, Jeri.
To desegregate is to remove the barriers which separate two classes of people, and to integrate is to bring them together, and so when we talk about desegregating, we're talking about removing the political barriers that are prohibiting people to coexist on an equal level, especially when we're talking about like government institutions. And if we are integrating, like Nina, for example, integrated into the white school as one person only, and not like a vast amount. So that was like the issue, I think, that we had. I hope I said that right. That's how I understand it. But yeah, those are my definitions.
Well, to me, segregation, everything was segregated. Like you said, here's a railroad track. You're on this side, and I'm on the other side. Literally, dance halls. You're dancing over here. I'm dancing over here. So segregation is like the physical mixing of the races together. And to me, integration is more ideological. It's more um, about culturally, how can we connect? So having um, civil rights education or race relations trainings, whether it's a faculty or staff, that's to me that's an example of integration. Or having diversity, equity, and inclusion, uh, being purposeful about integration is important to me. So to me, segregation is more physical and integration is more conceptual. That's just how I look at it.
Have a shout out from Donna who says, "Good background information. Thanks for your research." Thank you for watching, Donna.
Yes.
So there's a well documented achievement gap or in test scores and GPAs and college enrollment in students of different races, and it's noticeable in every state. But Arkansas sadly has one of the biggest gaps. So what are the core causes of the phenomenon there as it relates to this conversation?
Ms. Jeri.
I think that, for one, deficits in learning or deficits in just a general, like, that's, we have, it's not based on your race, for sure. Like, there is, that has nothing to do with it at all. Anybody of any race, if they have the proper supports at home, if they have a safe environment, if they have an encouraging environment, is going to do better in school, period. So I think when you look at what is making these disparities between Black and white students, it's not really Black and white students. We're looking at rich and poor. So I think if we looked at the correlation between the economic standings, and it doesn't even have to be rich. Arkansas is one of the poorest states that we have in the country. It is worse if you are in the southeastern part of the state versus the northwestern part of the state. And so if you average that in, it probably raises us up a little bit better. But if you're talking to a child in Southeast Arkansas and asking about their living conditions and their home life, as far as like, do their parents have a good job? Like, that kind of stuff, that is interrupting education, period, no matter what race you are. And I think that one of the things that Arkansas, unfortunately, does not invest in is to lift up poverty everywhere and to do things like improve healthcare, improve access to internet. We talk about it, but we don't really do it. We talk about reducing state income tax, but we don't talk about raising like teachers' wages. We don't talk about raising a lot of the other supports for people that will help them do better. And so if people are doing better, period, they are more likely to have healthier families, and they are likely to raise more confident and confidence not the word, but just to help children do better in school. Like, kids are not going to learn if they're hungry. They're not. Who wants to learn when they're hungry? I don't want to learn when I'm hungry. I don't even like to learn when I'm cold. You are in school, you don't feel like you fit in, your clothes or whatever, you have no electricity at home. Like, how are you going to, like, what do you even care about 4+4? Do you know what I'm saying? And that's where the problem is. It's not race. It's like, we live in a poor state. Let's fix that.
I couldn't have said it better. Yes, there are socioeconomic factors that affect these disparities, but also these standardized tests have been shown to have implicit biases in some of the ways that they are worded, and some of the cues and things, some of the figures of speech that unless you're in that social milieu, unless you're in that society, that social strata, you wouldn't pick up on. And so I think they're doing things, here lately to kind of address that, but just historically, there's always been these types of implicit biases in standardized testing. But we also have to look at, what questions did this person get right versus this person. And so when we start talking about diversity and inclusion, it's not always about how many did this person get right. Let's make a team of you got these right and you got these right, and you could have more of a well-rounded team if you do it that way. And so when we start having these conversations, we need to start looking at I might not be smart in math, but I'm talented, and what does smart look like, and looking at it more holistically, I think, is important.
I definitely agree with that. I mean, all districts are about to embark on their standardized testing, and it is a stressor period for students. And I mean, I remember when my kids were young and we would be, the parent PTO would be like making snacks and like trying to have like a party. Yay. I think we sent the drum line to the elementary school this year. Like the investment in these testing is just beyond like the test itself. Like it's outrageous. But I mean, people are more than a score for sure. Mm-hmm. And you can do things with students in so many different ways to test intelligence. And I think that that's something that we have to remember, is that your test scores or your grade in school is not always indicative of your ability. Some of that's kind of just like, did you turn in the work? Did you get it done on time? You know what I'm saying? And so it doesn't mean that you are not intelligent. There's other markers in there. And sometimes kids are, especially in this time of COVID, having to work so much. We teach high school, so having to work so much that, no, you're right, they're not studying the stuff that they have to do. But that's not because they don't want to study. That's because, like, if you really came down to it, learning about World War I and, this thing here is not as important as helping my mom pay this electricity bill on Wednesday. That's just a fact.
Beautiful answers. And that you kind of covered the next question, which was, do you think there's too much emphasis on standardized tests?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we need to know. We need to know if we're doing collectively well. Like, my department might know what our kids are doing, but I don't know what the math department is doing, for example. So I can see why people would want to know, are kids learning what we expect them to learn, for example. But the weight of the importance of the value of the school, of the grading of the school, of the fact that people think that our school is what it is because of a letter grade, and that therefore they judge the entire population of my students and their quality as a human. That's the problem with standardized testing. I'm not saying that schools and states don't have the right to just measure and to understand where kids are going and understanding that kind of stuff, and to make sure teachers are doing their job like that. There needs to be accountability, but when an entire community of people are judged by what one school ranks as, and that's a problem.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but I seem to remember when I was younger, there was a lot of pressure for everyone collectively to perform well because it would negatively affect funding. And it seems like it should be the opposite. If they're struggling in that area, the more funding should go to that school.
Very true.
That goes back to No Child Left Behind. Was that 2003 maybe? That was under the Bush era that funding was tagged to, standardized test results. But yes, standardized tests are necessary, but there's quantitative data and there's also qualitative data that we look at when we look at a student. I worked in admissions at Henderson State University, and you try to look at a student and okay, is there deficits and how do we address that deficit? I think that should be the question. Okay, is there provisional testing that you can do to fill these gaps, and how can we help a student instead of how do we judge? I think that needs to be the question. So once we identify those areas, how do we support?
We have Cicely watching, who you mentioned earlier, previous guest on the show. She says, yes, my mother, Nina Atkins, was selected to integrate Ricks Elementary. My grandmother, Jacqueline Price, also taught in HSSD for many years. Lots of history on this subject. Thank you for sharing. So what is the cultural or I guess even psychological impact on students who don't get to experience diversity?
Jeri.
Softball there.
I mean, on a qualitative level, I will say that they miss out on like experiences. I'm Mexican and Filipino, like I said, but I had friends. My parents were born, I'm a second generation American, but my friends, for example, who had parents that were raised in the Philippines, like just going to their house and experiencing their accents, their food, their customs, like that was awesome. And then having friends that were like Vietnamese, having my own family that was Filipino, like just all of that. Like I loved that. Like that's like super cool to just have all of these different people and to know what they do. And even being able to like go to their types of family parties or the way that they celebrate whatever holiday, like that's just like the beauty of life. Like there's just so much to experience, and I can't go to Vietnam, but I can go and celebrate with my friends when they're, celebrating like the lunar holiday or something like that. Like that was super awesome. Like, so growing up in a really diverse area, like I personally loved that. And when I came to Hot Springs and there was a lack of that just by sheer numbers, I was like, how do I make sure that my kids get a piece of that? Like, how do I make sure that I'm giving them as much of the world and of the people that the world has to offer as possible? How do I don't know. I wanted that for them. And so that's why I chose Hot Springs School District, because there were just more people there that could bring them experiences beyond what we had at our own house. And I think that, to be a true citizen of the world, to be a true citizen of America, is to really understand all its people and to see the people living their daily lives. Like if your only experience with Black people is sports, then you just have a performative perception of them, for example. Do you know what I'm saying? And I don't want I think that's ridiculous. Like that's not even that's an athlete. That's not the case, or if you only know Selena and she sings and dances and you're like, okay, that's how everybody, that's not the whole, that's a performer, and I just think that if you want to know people, you have to just know them. And that creates a more understanding, a more inquisitive person, a more tolerant person. And tolerant, I feel like is silly. Like you don't tolerate the people. You didn't learn to tolerate them. You just accept their existence. You just see their humanity, and you operate in a world of like, the world is big and people are vast and different, and it's totally cool. Like that's what I wanted for my kids. So that's what I think is, if people just remain, within their own echo chambers, then they just have these filtered realities of other races and culture that's not accurate, because they're only seeing it through the lens of whatever they perceive themselves, whatever lens they've built. And then, these, I don't know, examples that are, they are what they are. They're a performer, they're an athlete, or they're whatever. Like that's not, the race isn't a thing. It's the thing that they do. And I don't think that I think a lot of people that are sheltered don't recognize that. They think that's all it is.
That's hard to follow, Marsalis.
Well, I was, as she was talking, I was thinking, I didn't get my first Black teacher till I was in 5th grade, and that was Mary Wilson. She taught math. And it might have been, I want to say it might have been 6th grade. She taught math at the middle school. And so I said, what kind of experience on either side, if you're a Black student and you never had a Black teacher, like, how does that feel? And then on the flip side, I talked to a colleague that he had never had a Black teacher until he got to college. And so that just blew my mind. But I can kind of corroborate what Jeri said. I was part of that first international baccalaureate cohort, and then there were 7 of us. We had Vietnamese, we had Mexican, we had white, we had Ukrainian, we had Black, and so that cultural exchange is invaluable. And uh, something that's come out recently is this idea of blind spots. You don't know what blind spots you have out there until you have this type of inclusion at the forefront. There was these sensors a couple years ago where, you know how you go to the bathroom and you put your hands under the water. Well, they didn't work for Black people because they were designed in Germany, and in Germany they didn't have any Black test subjects to say, hey, does this work? So, you know, you start having problems when you don't design the world for everybody, you know. And so that's why diversity and inclusion is so important, is that we don't have these blind spots. And how does this other person's walk of life, that can be race, that can be ability, you know, it looks like a lot of different things. So I'm just gonna leave it at that because we could, you know, chase that rabbit.
Well, I'll give each one of you 2 mic drops. We have a wonderful comment from Cicely. When exposed to it early and often and taught to respect others, kids can learn to celebrate diversity. HSSD does a great job of this with staff and students, especially as compared to other districts, which is why I chose HSSD for my children, even though I attended another local district. No hate to the other districts, but we're all Trojans here, so we
it's just facts. It's just facts.
That's cool. And we don't, at the high school, you know, we don't have very many Hispanic or Mexican, Latino teachers. So for that, I'm one of the few. And I do hope that, you know, we, as the state itself becomes more diverse, and then Hot Springs will become more diverse, that we'll have more teachers of all colors in the building. But it is good to know that my children have always had women of color in power, and have had male teachers and all of that kind of stuff. Like, I mean, I am proud that my kids went to Hot Springs School District, and I am very proud of their education. At part, I was just a parent at that time. I loved it. I thought it was great. The staffing has gotten more diverse since I've left, or the kids have grown out of that section. And I don't know, I like it better. I feel like it fits my personal view, but how I grew up, and I was able to give that as much as possible to my own kids. And Hot Springs School District can do that for anybody's family.
Right. And, you know, yes, we've made advancements, but there's always room for improvement, and we can't rest on our laurels just yet. You know, there's always more that can be done. And while I'm president of NAACP, we'll be making sure that those conversations are had, and that, like you said, it's for the kids at the end of the day, and making sure our kids get the best education, and that we're serving everybody, and that everybody's at the table included in the conversation. So again, thank you, Miss, I almost said Dr. Maghoney. By faith. Thank you for everything that you've done. Teacher of the Year for 2020, 2021. Just going to reiterate that. That's an awesome honor. So thank you for your insight tonight. It was just phenomenal. And again, we just have scratched the surface of this topic. So we might have to have you back real soon.
Okay.
I would give you the Library Guest of the Month award, but we had Miss Eckford this month, so
I'll bow down to that one.
All right. Well, thank you both for joining us. And Marsalis, let's tell them what they have in store next month on Tuesday, May 17th.
May 17th. We hear the pomp and circumstance coming through our speakers because it's graduation time. And so for the month of May, we're going to be talking about Blacks in education, particularly higher education, and the importance of inclusion in the areas of faculty and staff, also looking at Black Greek letter organizations and the importance of that to the Black college experience. So it's Blacks in Education in the month of May. So get your cap and get your gown ready.
Are you going to dress up for it? Cap and gown?
You know me. We'll see. I got to find my stuff. I got my IV stole somewhere.
We have to get our full regalia out anyway for graduation coming up.
Yeah, okay, that's a good point. I already have it waiting in the wings, so it might not be a big deal. So
Marsalis is dressed up for at least a couple of episodes in this series, and like I said earlier, you can go back and watch any that you've missed in the playlist. But we did in October Black Horror, and what was your costume?
I was Pharaoh.
Pharaoh, yep. And then you dressed up for the holiday episode for Kwanzaa.
Yes, that's just me every day though. Like I just wear.
That's true.
Tired.
Cicely says I'll dust off my line jacket. All right. Well, any final remarks either of you'd like to share before we say goodbye?
Thank you guys for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Well, again, thank you, Mr. Paul, for always having us. It was wonderful. And again, we just look forward every month to this conversation. And thank Mr. Kegban, thank Mr. Webb, and thank the Garland County Library for this continued partnership. And hopefully there'll be many, many more to come.
Absolutely. And thank you, audience, for watching. See you next time.
All right, take care.